They are about to pull the rug out from under every single American who still believes they will ever own a home. The entire housing market is a mammoth bubble, distorted by unsustainable stimulus and artificially low rates for years. And now the collapse has already begun. You can hear the creaking in the equity markets, the sudden nervous silence in the open houses, the desperate look in the eyes of realtors who know the party is over but cannot afford to say it out loud. But while I have been warning you about this for months, there is a hidden escape hatch, a way to sidestep the entire impending catastrophe that almost nobody is talking about. Tucked away on public lands, on lake shores and in forests that the government already owns and will never sell to a billionaire developer, are thousands of cabins that you could live in for decades. And you can secure one for less money than you spend each year on car insurance, if you know where to look and how to play the game. Because the game is rigged, but the loophole is real. And I am going to walk you through 5 of them today before the door slams shut for good. We humbly ask you to support our work with a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon, because what I am about to reveal is being quietly dismantled as we speak. The very last state on this list, Idaho, has already decided to cash out, auctioning off the lots from under families who thought they had a lifetime arrangement. The wrecking crews have already shown up at the water's edge, and the cabins that stood for 60 years are now a pile of splinters. I stood on that same shore a lifetime ago, and it was as close to heaven as a working family can get. The kind of place where the water laps so gently against the dock that you forget the whole world is on fire. You need to see what awaits if you wait too long, and you need to see it now. Every day the official numbers come out and they scream disaster. Yet the television talking heads and the Treasury Secretary stand at the podium and tell you everything is fine. Home prices are stratospheric. A median family cannot afford a median house without taking on a mammoth debt that will choke them when the next recession hits. By some reliable estimates, the average family now has to spend more than half its income just to keep a roof overhead. And that number is climbing like a fever. Rents are so inflated that millions of working Americans are just one missed paycheck from the street. Shelter costs, according to the latest government consumer price data, are climbing faster than they have in 40 years. And yet, the same government that presided over this runaway inflation also happens to own millions of acres of the most beautiful land in the country, with existing cabins already built, and it leases them out for a few $100s a year to ordinary people who know the secret. That is not a coincidence. That is a lifeline hidden in plain sight while the rest of the system burns. When I was growing up back in the 1970s, I remember my father staring at the gas lines and the grocery bills and telling me that we needed a fallback. Somewhere simple and self-sufficient that didn't depend on the madness of the economy. We looked into a state lease cabin up in the mountains, and even though we never pulled the trigger, the idea has stayed with me my entire life. I can still smell the musty paper of the government brochures we sent away for, the thin airmail envelopes with their promises of trout streams and wood stoves, and a life that didn't require a landlord's permission. The beauty of these arrangements is that you are not buying the land. You are not taking on a crushing 30-year mortgage at 7% interest that will drown you. You are leasing the dirt from the state, often for 10 or 15 years at a stretch, and you own the cabin on top of it. That means your cost of entry is tiny compared to the froth in the private market. And if the economy goes into the catastrophic tailspin I have been prophesying, you have a roof over your head beside a lake that you basically control for pocket change. Now let me show you where these sanctuaries are hidden, starting with the cleanest version of this dream that still exists. Montana. The state owns roughly 2.5 million acres of trust land, set aside more than a century ago to fund public schools and other institutions. And scattered across that enormous portfolio, on some of the best lake shore and hunting ground anywhere in the country, are cabin sites that the state leases directly to ordinary citizens. I recall driving through western Montana years ago, the Bitterroot Range glowing pink in the late afternoon, and stopping at a general store where a local told me about a family that had a lease on a lake tucked back in the pines, a place you could only reach by a one-lane road that washed out every spring. He said they paid less for the year than he spent on feed for his horses, and they never missed a summer there in nearly 40 years. The mechanism is almost too good to believe the first time you hear it, so listen closely. You bid on a lease for the land itself, usually a 15-year term, And the yearly rent is calculated off the state's own appraised land value, which is a polite way of saying it comes out to a fraction of what private lakefront would cost. The state's trust land office posts bidding opportunities on its public website, and you can request a map of available sites, though the truly prime spots often trade quietly before they ever see a public listing. Then and only then you buy the cabin, the physical structure, from the previous leaseholder as a completely separate private transaction. The structure is yours. You can improve it, you can pass it to your children. And the state cannot whimsically sell the ground out from under you because the land is held in trust for the schoolchildren, not for a developer's profit. But here is the part that should make your heart beat faster in the middle of this financial storm. In recent years, Montana has started allowing some of those longtime leaseholders to buy their lots outright, converting decades of patient renting into actual deeded ownership of the lakefront. That means you can get in cheap, you can hold on through the coming economic tsunami. And then one day the renter becomes the owner of ground that would otherwise never come up for sale to a normal person. It is a slow, quiet front door into wealth, while the rest of the country is being forced into renting forever. And the government, for once, is not the enemy. It is the silent partner handing you an arc. Now we move east to Pennsylvania, which has the most stubborn and secretive version of this arrangement I have ever uncovered. Threaded through the state forests are more than 4,000 leased cabin sites, each one a little quarter-acre parcel with a cabin standing on it, held by a private family on a 10-year lease from the state. The annual rent for these spots is $200. Not a month, not a week, $200 for the entire year. That is less than one single night at a mediocre motel by the time they finish tacking on the fees and the taxes. When I look at how much the average family now spends on streaming subscriptions and delivery apps while complaining they cannot save a dime, I just shake my head. Because here is a whole cabin in the woods for the price of giving up one coffee a week. But there is a twist that keeps this out of the hands of the lazy and the late. Pennsylvania stopped issuing brand new leases in 1970, more than 50 years ago. The state will tell you flatly in writing that under no circumstances are any new leases being granted. Full stop. So how does an ordinary person get one? You cannot put your name on a list. You cannot submit an application. Instead, you must inherit the pathway from a total stranger. You find a cabin already sitting on one of these lease sites, one whose current family is finally ready to let go. And you buy the cabin itself from them. When you do, the state quietly transfers the existing lease into your name. You are not buying land. You are buying a building, and gently stepping into a 50-year-old relationship between a family and a piece of public forest that the Commonwealth has promised never to sell. And because there is no public listing, an entire underground culture has grown up, with families posting quiet notices in local papers and online forums. Cabin wanted near a trout stream, cabin wanted in this particular forest. They wait years for the right one to come loose. I remember more than a decade ago, leafing through a shopper's guide in a diner in the Poconos, a place that smelled of fried onions and old coffee, and seeing a tiny ad for a cabin on state forest land. Just a box number and a price so low I thought it was a misprint. I didn't pursue it, but that ad has haunted me ever since. There are rules, of course, and they tell you everything about what these places are truly designed for. The cabin cannot be your permanent legal residence. You must prove you actually live somewhere else with a real address. You cannot run a business out of it. You must be a Pennsylvania resident. And every couple of years, a forester walks the property line to make sure you have not let it slide into a junkyard. Because the land is still public, still part of the forest everyone shares. And that is something you must take dead seriously. Because I have heard of families who tried to slip through the cracks, who moved their life into the cabin and thought nobody would notice. And they lost everything they had invested when the state moved in and revoked the lease. In a country that finds a way to monetize every square inch, Pennsylvania accidentally built a tiny preserve for the simple, unprofitable act of having a place in the trees. And that, my friends, is the kind of inflation-proof asset that the central bankers cannot devalue with their printing presses. From there, we go north into the wilds of Maine, where the road signs start to feel more like polite suggestions, and the silence is so deep it practically has a texture. Maine owns hundreds of thousands of acres of public reserved lands deep in the North Woods. The country of moose and trout ponds and no cell signal for miles. I once drove hours down a logging road to find a sporting camp that was listed in an old guidebook. And when I finally arrived, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat and the far-off cry of a loon that seemed to be the only sound for miles. The damp pine needles muffled every step and the air carried the cool, clean smell of a lake that had never been touched by a motorboat. The state's Parks and Lands Bureau holds a quiet portfolio of camp leases on that land. Residential camp lots where a family keeps a cabin beside a remote pond at the literal end of the road. And sporting camp leases. The old hand-hewn lodges that have guided hunters and fishermen for well over a century. The terms up here are humble and beautifully old-fashioned. A camp lease can run in 5-year increments, and the minimum yearly fee written right into state law is just $150, with a total rent cap tied to a small slice of the land's appraised value. That means, adjusted for inflation, you can literally pay less per year for a wilderness retreat than my father paid for a season of heating oil back in the 1970s. There is a transfer mechanism built in so that certain residential leases can pass from one holder to the next, rather than vanishing into the woods when somebody dies. And there are genuine legends inside this system. I have heard of one famous sporting camp tucked deep in the unorganized townships where the state legislature specifically extended the lease to 30 years and made it renewable on top of that, because the place is a working year-round lodge that has earned its keep across generations of guides. Now let me be completely honest with you, because this audience checks everything and deserves the unvarnished truth. Most of these leases are legacy holdings. You are far more likely to step into an existing camp lease than to have the state carve you a brand new one freshly cut out of the spruce. But that is not a door slammed in your face, that is a treasure map. The way in is the same patient way it has always been. You get to know the country, you meet the people at the local diner. You let it be known quietly that you are looking, and sometimes, if you are lucky and humble enough, a name is passed along on a slip of paper. Occasionally, a lease comes up for public bid through the bureau. And if you are on the mailing list and watching the notices like a hawk, you will know about it before the rest of the world. In a world that is about to get very chaotic, having a remote, off-grid shelter that costs you next to nothing could mean the difference between riding out the storm and being swept away by it. Now we arrive at the strangest entry on the entire list. The one I need to describe with the most care because the lazy version of this story that gets passed around online is simply wrong. People will tell you that you can lease a cabin directly from the state in the Adirondacks of New York. That is not quite it, and the real version is honestly far more interesting and far more useful to someone who wants to survive the coming collapse. In the very heart of the Adirondack Park, a massive private timber company holds vast sweeping tracts of forest, and those tracts sit underneath a permanent conservation easement held by the State Environmental Agency. I remember one autumn hike up near the high peaks, coming down through a stand of sugar maples just as they turned gold, the air sharp with the smell of balsam, and seeing a small cabin tucked away off the trail, its stovepipe puffing a thin thread of smoke. Later I learned it sat on one of those timber company leases, a single private acre in the middle of forever. That easement is the entire key. It means the public can hike and hunt and roam freely across that land, even though a private company technically owns every acre. And on those very same working forest lands, the company offers something it calls a cabin site license. On the ground, it works like this. You lease a single acre, one small private envelope of woods at a specific spot the company points you to, and you are permitted to put up a cabin and occupy it in exchange for an annual fee. If you call the company's land management office and ask politely about cabin site licenses, you might be surprised at the conversation that follows. These deals are not advertised loudly. They are maintained quietly for people who show genuine respect for the land. Your one quiet acre of solitude sits in the middle of thousands of acres of productive timberland that the public gets to wander through. You are not leasing from the government at all. You are leasing from a private company on land that the state has quietly and permanently promised will stay wild forever. It is a layered, almost poetic arrangement. A small private lease wrapped inside a giant public guarantee in the middle of the largest protected park in the lower 48 states. You get a key to a single acre in a backyard the rough size of a small country. And the only catch is that you must make peace with the occasional hiker passing through your woods. But in the world we are entering, where neighbors may become desperate and privacy will be a luxury. Having a 1-acre sanctuary inside a fortress of public conservation land might be the most brilliant defensive move you could make. And because the lease is private, not governmental, it avoids some of the political whims that we are about to see in Idaho. And that brings us finally to Idaho, the cautionary tale that proves everything I have been warning you about. For more than 100 years, going back to the early 1900s, the state of Idaho leased out cottage sites along the shores of two almost unfairly beautiful lakes. Priest Lake up north, ringed by mountains so steep they seem to rise straight out of the water, and Piet Lake down by the town of McCall, where the water is so clear you can count the pebbles 30 feet down. The same basic arrangement as everywhere else. The state owned the land, held it in trust to fund public schools, and the families owned the cabins they built on it. Generation after generation, ordinary working people drove up to those lakes, signed a modest lease, and built something out of wood and weekends. Not investments, but memories with plumbing. Cabins where great-grandparents taught their grandchildren to swim off the same weathered dock. I remember talking to a man years ago, he must have been in his late 70s. Sitting on his porch and pointing out across the water to where his father and uncles hammered together the first cabin in 1968, with nothing but hand tools and a case of beer. He told me about the first fish his children caught. The way his wife could sit on that dock for hours and read, and never finish a single chapter because she was so mesmerized by the light on the mountains. He spoke of it like it was a family member. And then, in 2010s, the state board that oversees that land decided it was their legal duty to wring the absolute most money possible out of those school trust lands. They looked at the lake lots, did the cold arithmetic, and decided to get out of the cabin leasing business entirely. They would auction the lots off one by one for full deeded ownership and roll every last dollar into the school endowment. The auction started in 2014, and they have raised a genuinely astonishing amount of money. Hundreds of lots sold, well over $200 million funneled into the trust. By the letter of the law, it is a clean and total triumph. But for the families who had been the stewards of those shores for decades, it was a betrayal of biblical proportions. I spoke with a woman who had to watch the auction from her kitchen table, clicking the bidding page with shaking hands. And when the price soared past her life savings, she just closed the laptop and wept. The final short-term leases are set to run out this very year, and after that the choice is brutally simple. You buy your lot at full auction value against anyone in the country who shows up with more money. Or you walk away from the place your grandparents built with their own hands. There is no third option, and last summer on one specific lot on the east side of Priest Lake the inevitable happened. The man whose father first carried him up there as an infant. The man who as a young boy had helped tear down the old shack and build a new cabin with his brothers. Watched helplessly from afar as a new owner who won the auction sent in a crew. Over the span of just a few days, they tore that hand-built cabin down to absolutely nothing. He found out almost by accident from a neighbor who happened to call. Total shock was the only thing he could manage to say. That is the thing about a lease that the wonderfully cheap rent makes so dangerously easy to forget. A lease is a borrowed thing. It can be the warmest, most generous door into a lakeside existence that an ordinary person will ever be handed. And it can also quietly and legally simply end. The same state that funds its schoolchildren off the value of that shoreline sent the crews to tear the family cabins down in order to do it. And you can be absolutely furious about it and still understand it completely. Because the rules were written in plain sight the entire time. Nobody hid the ending in the fine print. People just could not quite bear to look straight at it from the comfort of the dock. So I say to you now, before you ever sign one of these leases in any state, you must understand the difference in your bones between owning a place and being trusted with one. The two feel completely identical when you are standing barefoot on the dock at sunset with a drink in your hand. They are not even slightly identical on the cold morning the lease finally comes due. And the single most useful move you can make, the thing almost nobody ever does, is to watch the county tax records. When one of these leases changes hands, when a cabin quietly sells, the new owner shows up on the tax roll because even out on leased public land, the cabin itself is taxed as real estate with a real human name attached to it. So a lease changing hands does not mean the trail goes cold. It means there is a fresh name sitting in a public file. You can pull the parcel record for the exact lake you have loved your whole life. You can find out precisely who holds that cabin now. And you can write the one honest handwritten letter that nobody else in the world thinks to send. Not typed, not an email, a handwritten letter on decent paper with a real stamp. Because that tells the recipient you are not a speculator, you are a human being. I once wrote that letter myself. I had found a cabin on a leased lot in the Allegheny National Forest, a place I had driven past as a kid and never forgotten. I sent a note to the owner, a man in his 70s whose name I pulled from the county assessor's website. He called me back 2 months later, his voice thin but kind, and said he had been waiting to find the right person for years. I didn't end up taking the lease, but we talked for an hour. And I learned more about the quiet world of these cabins in that one conversation than I could ever learn from a website. The letter that simply says, I am not an agent, I am not flipping anything. I just love this place more than I can say. And if you ever find yourself thinking about letting it go, please think of me first. That single letter, mailed to the right name on the right parcel, has quietly started more of these deals than every listing website on earth combined. That is the real secret running underneath all 5 of these states. The cabins are real, the leases are real, the bargains are almost offensively real. But none of them sits on a tidy website with a big orange button that says buy it now. They move quietly the old way, family to family, name to name, the way they always have and the way they always will. And in the economic firestorm that is coming, when the standard avenues of housing collapse under the weight of their own unsustainable debt, the people who end up beside the water with the loon and the wood stove and their own name on the lease will not be the people with the most money. They will be the people who knew where to look, who knew what to ask, and who were patient and humble enough to write the letter and then wait. Now I want you to understand the larger picture here. What Idaho did is not an isolated event. It is just the tip of the iceberg. Governments at every level are desperate for revenue to fund their bloated budgets and pay down the stratospheric national debt. The pressure to monetize public assets is going to become overwhelming. The cabins in Montana and Pennsylvania and Maine that look secure today may not be there tomorrow. The bureaucrats who today smile and say they are preserving these arrangements for the public good will be the same ones who petition the board to sell them off when the pension funds crater. I have seen it happen before. I remember the asset sales in the 1980s when states unloaded treasured public holdings to paper over budget holes. And I am telling you now, the clock is ticking, these windows are closing. If you want to secure a place that can shelter your family through the coming apocalypse for a few $100s a year, you must move now, not next year, not after the next election now. Because the day the government decides to cash out, you will be standing there with your checkbook in your hand while a billionaire outbids you by a factor of 10. And the cabin your children were supposed to inherit will end up as a pile of rubble on the shore. The bumpy ride ahead is going to make the 2008 housing crash look like a Sunday picnic. The froth in the markets is already disappearing, stock prices are plummeting. Millions are about to be thrown out of work. And the ordinary family is going to be squeezed until there is nothing left. But you do not have to be a victim of this engineered crisis. There is a way to step off the hamster wheel, to quietly acquire a piece of paradise that is immune to the insanity, and to ride out the storm in a place that costs you less than a single month's rent. The government, in its inefficient and contradictory way, still holds these keys. It is up to you to grab one before they melt them down for scrap. I have shown you 5 real, tangible, working examples. The Montana lake lease that can slowly turn into full ownership. The gloriously stubborn old Pennsylvania cabin you inherit from a stranger for $200 a year. The remote Maine sporting camp at the end of the world. The private acre tucked inside the vast Adirondack forest. And the heartbreaking Idaho lesson that taught us all what a lease really costs when the state decides its loyalty is to the endowment, not to the family. What are your thoughts? Which of these secret sanctuaries would you stake your future on? And once you closed the door behind you and the place was at last yours to fall asleep in with the windows open, what is the first thing you would do? Write it down in the comments, because that conversation, that community of people who see the truth and are preparing, is the only thing that will keep us all afloat when the rest of the country goes under. Thank you for watching, and may you find your own ark before the waters rise.